Something has shifted inside the royal family, and people can feel it, even if nobody in the palace is willing to say it out loud. King Charles is still on the throne, still the official face of the monarchy, but the atmosphere around him has changed. Every public appearance is studied more closely. Every absence triggers fresh questions. Every image released by the palace feels less like reassurance and more like damage control. And that's why so many royal watchers are now asking the same thing. Is the monarchy quietly preparing for something much bigger than it wants the public to see? The first sign that something is wrong isn't what the palace says. It's what the palace is suddenly trying too hard not to say. That's what makes the current moment feel so unusual. Royal silence has always been part of the system, but now that silence feels heavier, more deliberate, more loaded. With Charles, the conversation no longer stays focused on ceremony, duty, or leadership for very long. It keeps drifting back to health, strength, and how much control he still really has. And in a monarchy built on image, that is not a small shift. Once the public starts seeing a sovereign as vulnerable instead of steady, the symbolism begins to change. And once people started noticing that silence, a much bigger question came into focus. Because behind the ceremony and tradition, there's a cold constitutional reality the monarchy can't escape. However grand the spectacle may look from the outside, the crown is still an institution governed by rules, mechanisms, and contingency plans. If a monarch becomes unable to fully carry out the role, there are legal pathways that can move authority elsewhere. Most of the time, those rules stay in the background because the palace never wants the public thinking in those terms. But the moment uncertainty enters the picture, those old structures stop feeling distant. They suddenly feel immediate. That's when the conversation stops being emotional and starts becoming strategic. The issue is no longer just about Charles as a man. It becomes about the monarchy as a system, and whether that system is already preparing for a new center of gravity. And that reality points directly to the two royals now being watched more closely than anyone else. William may be the heir on paper, but Catherine is becoming just as important in a very different way. Together, they increasingly look like the monarchy's answer to instability. William carries the obvious constitutional weight, but Catherine brings something harder to manufacture: public confidence. She projects calm, discipline, and control. And in moments of uncertainty, those qualities matter just as much as bloodline. That's why their appearances now feel different from before. They no longer just look like the future. More and more, they look like the figures the institution is already leaning on in the present. And in royal life, that kind of symbolic shift can matter long before any official transfer of power happens. But if those two are rising, it also raises an uncomfortable question about who could be losing ground. And that's where Camilla becomes impossible to ignore, because titles matter, but public trust matters more. Her formal position may be clear, but public feeling around her has always been more complicated. In calmer times, that tension can be managed through appearances, protocol, and routine. But in a moment of uncertainty, emotional legitimacy suddenly becomes crucial. People don't just want to know who holds rank. They want to know who represents stability. And that is where the contrast becomes impossible to miss. William and Catherine often appear to embody continuity in a way that feels instinctively reassuring to the public. Camilla, fairly or unfairly, does not inspire that same reaction. In a fragile moment for the monarchy, that difference matters more than ever. Still, the palace has refused to spell any of this out clearly, and that may be making everything worse. Because when the monarchy goes quiet, speculation doesn't slow down, it explodes. Every delayed appearance, every changed schedule, every carefully staged photograph starts getting examined like a clue. The palace may believe silence protects the institution, but silence also creates a vacuum, and vacuums invite stories. Some of those stories are dramatic. Some are exaggerated. Some are outright fantasy. But they all grow from the same source: the sense that something important is being managed behind the scenes. Once that feeling takes hold, the public stops trusting appearances at face value. They start looking for what isn't being shown. And that's exactly when ordinary royal updates start feeling like signals from a deeper struggle. And once enough people sense a vacuum, the conversation stops being about rumors and starts being about power. Here's the part most people miss. Power doesn't always change hands in one dramatic moment. It can shift quietly, symbolically, and almost invisibly. Influence can move before authority does. Loyalty can reposition itself before titles ever change. The monarchy understands this better than anyone. It doesn't need a public rupture to begin adapting. It only needs enough people inside the system to recognize where stability now lives. And that may be exactly what we're watching. Not a sudden overthrow, not open palace warfare, but a silent rebalancing, where the institution begins relying more heavily on William and Catherine because they represent the safest path forward. That kind of transition is far more subtle than the public expects, and often far more powerful, which leads to the biggest and most unsettling question of all. What if the transition has already started and the public is only now realizing it? That may be the real story hidden beneath all the careful statements and polished appearances. Charles is still king. That has not changed. But the deeper question is whether the monarchy has already begun shifting its emotional and strategic weight toward the next generation. Because once the public starts seeing William and Catherine not merely as heirs, but as the practical center of stability, the transition is no longer just a future event. It becomes a present reality in everything except formal title. And in royal life, perception has a way of turning into fact long before any official announcement confirms it. So maybe this moment won't be remembered for a dramatic palace showdown or some open struggle for the throne. Maybe it will be remembered for something quieter, the point at which the crown stayed exactly where it was, but the center of power began moving somewhere else. The palace may never say that directly. It may never need to, because in a monarchy built on image, ritual, and symbolism, the shift doesn't have to be declared to be real. It only has to be felt. And right now, more people than ever seem to feel that the future of the monarchy is no longer waiting in the distance. It's already stepping into the room. Because in royal life, the crown can stay exactly where it is, even while the center of power moves somewhere else.